So, hello and everyone to another live stream that we are hosting in a Permit.io. I'll start with a really short announcement. So, first, we are recording everything. If you just need to go, you can go. You can get to that later in YouTube. We are sharing the email we are sharing the YouTube link in email after the live stream. And if you have any kind of question and answers, I know we are streaming in YouTube and LinkedIn and Twitter, wherever you are watching us, you can just write comment and we'll answer the question. We're trying to answer all the questions live, but we'll anyway have some time at the end of the hour to get some questions. And I want to thank to Permit.io, the company I work for. We are doing live stream mostly every week around topics that are getting interest in software developer or for software developers. And now I really want to thank our guests for today, Tarus Balog and Ricardo Sueiras, who joined us from AWS. They are all masters in the open source. I met Ricardo, I think, a year ago around the AWS Cedar. We'll get to that. And he introduced me to Taro. So really happy to have you today here. And I'll be happy if you can introduce yourself, have a couple of words. So, Ricardo.
Yeah. So thank you for inviting us, Gab, onto your podcast. So yes, for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Ricardo Sueiras. I'm a developer advocate at AWS. I have spent probably 20 plus years working with open source. I think my origin story is around, I think I was working for an enterprise company and it's hard to imagine. We used to pay for web servers, and I was building web servers using Netscape by Planet, and I can't remember what the licensing model was. It was horrendous, and I discovered this project called Apache HTTPD server. Which actually, as it happens, Rich Bowen, who now works with us, with Taurus and myself, he actually was very heavily involved in that project, in the documentation. So it's really weird how you kind of bump into people, and I think this is a common thing. But anyway, I'll get back. So I kind of got started with it, built it. And I thought, wow, this is really good. This is a really much better web server than Netscape iPlanet. And I think I really got interested in it from that point on. And from there, I went on to Linux, and I really kind of got the open source vibe. And I was working with a lot of proprietary software at the time. And so I kind of made it my mission to try and help figure out why should we use proprietary software when this open source software was often as good, if not better. And so along that journey, it was quite interesting. I did a lot of stuff. I basically helped build enablement teams, work with non-technical people around convincing them about what open source was to help them do their jobs better, work and focus on strategy to make sure that the non-technical people understood why we were doing this. And kind of really went from there. So and the last few years I've been working with Taurus and David and Rich and Spot and a few others, helping to kind of like tell the story of open source at AWS and hopefully making AWS the best place to run open source workloads. So that's a little bit of my story. So yeah, I'm you cut me, you get open source. We can't hear you. I think you're on mute, Gab.
I do. You're right.
There we go.
Yeah, I think there's some great point that you already put, and we'll definitely get back to that later. But I wanted Taras also give you the chance to introduce yourself.
Sure. My name's Tarus Balog, and I've only been at AWS a little over 2 years. So Ricardo's much more senior in that aspect. And I do open source at AWS. I mainly work with open source partners, so companies that create open source and in many cases hosted on AWS. Now, prior to joining AWS, I ran an open source company for 20 years. I cut my teeth on network monitoring, and so I used a lot of very expensive, HP OpenView, IBM Tivoli, a lot of these expensive proprietary products. And some acquaintances of mine had started this open source thing called OpenNMS for a network monitoring system. They started it in 1999. And I joined them on September 10th, 2001. It's a very easy day to remember because on September 11th, 2001, we watched TV like the rest of the world. And in 2002, the company decided that they weren't going to do open source anymore. And so I kind of thought, hey, maybe I can make this work. And so I went to the CEO and I said, hey, I want to continue OpenNMS. And he kind of looked at his watch and he said, well, if you're off my payroll by Friday, we'll give you a couple of servers and we'll send you on your way. That was the easy part. Explaining to my wife that I had quit my job and I was going to sell free software was a little bit harder. I mean, we've been together over 30 years, so something must have worked. But she informed me in the future that this would be what we call a we decision and not a me decision. But we kept it going. We kept it going for 20 years. In 2019, we sold the business, and I parted ways in 2021, as things happen when you sell a company. And I was just not. I didn't know what I was going to do next, and I got introduced to AWS through this guy named Spot Calloway, who Ricardo mentioned. Spot worked at Red Hat forever, and he's also a big Fedora maintainer. And he said, hey, we're doing open source at AWS. And I kind of used air quotes, open source at AWS. And then I met the team. I met people like Ricardo. My boss is a gentleman named David Nally, who's the president of the Apache Software Foundation. One of our coworkers is Rich Bowen, who's on the board of directors of the Apache Software Foundation, which is funny because in the office, David is Rich's boss. At Apache, Rich is David's boss. And we are really working hard to change the perception of open source at AWS to make it very friendly. And as Ricardo mentioned, we're hoping that it becomes the default place to run your open source workloads.
Yeah. So I think you both mentioned two events that makes you from a technical person to open source technical person. You first mentioned that you take the business decision that you don't want to continue with closed source, so you decide I want to go open. And you mentioned, Ricardo, the HTTPD and how you find that open source software, make it better than closed source or proprietary software. But if we're looking today, what are the open source project in AWS that you're most exciting about?
Well, I don't think I could go very long without mentioning Valkey.
Oh, so, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's the obvious one. I mean, I'll let you go. Ricardo. No, you were more involved in that.
But I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think Valkey it's so hot at the moment. Actually,
so you do Valkey. I've got another one. So okay, you do Valkey and good. You do, and then I'll do mine.
Yeah, actually, I was trying to channel my Zoolander then. It's I won't do my Blue Steel or Magnum. But yeah, Valkey is the open source fork of Redis, which was forked earlier in the year. I can't remember the exact date, but it was around April, May time, I think. And version 8 is currently, I think, in beta. It's going to be launched soon, I think, hopefully. But it's really exciting because obviously Redis is one of the most favorite databases by developers. I think in the DB Engines thing, I think it's always in the top 5 or top 10. Now, I have not really been a big time Redis user. So over the last couple of months, I've been getting really deep into Valkey, and I tell you what, it's fantastic. I love it. So I'm really excited. I've been at a couple of events, and I've been using these new generative AI tools that we have one called Amazon Q Developer, and I've been using it to actually create code that works with Valkey. Right, so I'm creating demos and all this kind of stuff. So I'm really really getting excited about this project, and I think why I'm excited about it is it's good that the community around Redis were able to react so quickly, fork the project, and keep the community, as much of as wanted to come to kind of keep this project going in an open source way, right? And when you hear about all the other stuff going on, it's great that we've got one good success story, and it shows how the communities come together. All the other stakeholders, like Ericsson, Snap, Oracle, I think obviously ourselves, AWS, and others, right? The core maintainer, I think it's Alibaba as well, Tencent. That all the kind of maintainers have come together and they're kind of propelling that project forward. Which if you go back when I talk about when I first got into open source, a few years after I was really kind of getting into it, we had the whole Hudson debacle, right? Where Hudson was bought by Oracle. The community didn't like it. They forked, and Jenkins is what we got. And people have been using Jenkins ever since. And no one ever talks about Hudson anymore, right? And I think that's what's going to happen with Valky. I think Valky will become the new Jenkins, right? And everyone will soon forget about what it was before.
Really, that is interesting. I mean, the shift that the community can do for such, like, I think Redis, because it's like the silence DB. No matter what your main data model in your app, SQL, non-SQL, at the end you'll find Redis somewhere.
You always do. You always find Redis, right?
Yeah.
It's there.
And that's great to see. Like I think the Hudson and Jenkins is interesting because it was also evolving a trend of like DevOps and automation. It created a new motion of people to do things, and I didn't know it was like a close. I born into Jenkins era, but always a good story. How
I
about
mean, to be fair, I mean, I don't think they closed it. I think that the reasons why the community forked it were not because they changed the license. I think what it was is the community was worried and concerned about the direction that it would go, and that's why. So there are, obviously forking is part of the open source way, and it's kind of the ultimate, tool that open source communities have to take projects in the direction that the community wants.
Yeah, I have a problem with forks. To me, should always be a last resort, and it's very hard to get, for someone who hasn't been in open source for a very long time to get their brain around.
Yeah,
I mean, it's always an option, but the first option is always cooperation. Like you talked about Oracle, when Oracle bought Sun and therefore got MySQL. We recently have a new one where Databricks bought Tabular, which was the main company behind Apache Iceberg. And that community is struggling. And a lot of people, the knee-jerk reaction is to pull a Jenkins. Let's just proactively do this. And it's like, well, look, Databricks is there seem to be good stewards of this. They don't want to change the direction of Iceberg. They want to make it work a little bit better with their tool. But I think forks should definitely be a last resort. And so I'm hoping that as we kind of navigate this, when there's all these license changes and things like that, forks are possible and forks are there. But wherever possible, I think it's our role to show that users as a whole benefit if we play nice.
Yeah, totally.
If we've got all this expertise and we all want to solve problems for our users, I mean, that's why we're here. And so, but the fact that you can fork as a last resort is always there as an option.
I think the fork thing. I'm not sure how deep we want to dive in that, but we saw that multiple times in the last years. We saw CNCF took care of the Open Tofu, and we saw back then in the Elasticsearch again that Amazon. But some people can say maybe it has also business prioritization, right?
It's interesting to see RedMonk just, which is an analyst company, just published something this week where they did a deep dive into a number of Mongo, Confluent, Elastic, and HashiCorp, which are three big companies that changed their license.
Also
and the business benefit, with the possible exception of Mongo, the business benefit hasn't really been there. I mean, market caps plateaued. So I think it's counterintuitive. I mean, and I'm hoping that lessons such as Valky and things like this kind of say, it may seem obvious that, if I can lock down this, then I'll lock in my users and generate more revenue. But that's not necessarily the case. And the data is showing that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah.
Now, I just want to stress, if you do all the work and you create the code and you own the copyright, it's up to you to make those decisions. But on the other hand, it's up to the community of your users to make their own decisions.
I think one interesting question that also comes often a lot with permit. If I'm now a young founder of a new startup, and I'm asking you what is the right model for me to go with open source. I can go open core, and then potentially I'll have to change my license. I can go with more like innovative models, like what we did in Permit. So we are not open core, but our engine is open, and there's no real reason to put it because our propriety is more like the Permit product. What will be your like advice for such a founder?
This is something that actually I've been asked lots of times over the last few years by mainly by startups actually, and actually I've interviewed some of them on the DevRel channel, and I always kind of answer that question with another question, right? Which I think the thing that open source is not a business model, and so I think what you need to understand is actually what are you trying to achieve with open source, and once you understand the why. The way I try and explain it is that open source provides you different levers, okay, and you can do it lots of different ways. So the question is, depending on what you want to do as a business, do the open source levers provide you with some advantage or something? And from there, then I think that helps them make the decision. And it's interesting, nearly all the startup founders that I've spoken with have all in the end had that conversation and ended up open sourcing using Apache 2 licenses, and one of them, AppSmith, okay, which is a kind of low code platform out of India. I still stay in contact with them. They have found a lot of success in that model because what they were trying to do is drive lots of interest with developers and get kind of the plugin stroke extension market kind of growing, and that was really pivotal in making sure that those developers that invested time doing those plugins weren't going to lose that investment because they realized that the system they were working on was all open source. So that's just some examples that I've had recently.
Yeah, I think this point of like open source is not a business model is very good assumption. It's actually a good statement, and for many, I'm not sure that people that do open core as their main startup code model thinking about that as like a business model. There is a point I want to get to that later, but I saw that Tarus has something there.
Oh, sure. I have a lot. I mean, like we said, when we were in the warm up, I could talk for the next 7 hours without a break on this stuff.
Oh yeah.
So one of the things, if you're doing open source, you're basically creating free software, and you can't sell free software. I mean, there's some corner cases where you can charge people for it, but you can't make a business like the way, like the first open source multimillionaire I remember was Mitch Kapoor. He did Lotus 1-2-3. And you'd buy an IBM PC, and the first thing you do is buy Lotus 1-2-3. And it's one of those great things. You create it, it costs a lot of money to create, but it costs almost no money to replicate. And so you get these big margins. It's great. So I've done a lot of thought about this, and I said, look, what you sell if you're an open source company is you sell three things. You sell security, stability. Wait, why am I? There's three S's, and I'm missing one of my S's. The simplicity, simplicity, security, and stability, and this is where managed open source comes in. I talk a lot about WordPress. I'm old. I have blogs. They're these things that happened before social media, and they were really popular until Google killed Reader. But that's another topic. But anyway, WordPress, they have this thing called a 5-minute install, and it is great. It's like you go to your server, you go to your web root, you drop in a tarball, expand the tarball, go to a page, fill out the name of your database user, hit go, and you have a WordPress server. 5-minute install. I can do it in 2. But if you don't understand the command line and you don't know how to make a database user and you don't have a server, you can go to WordPress.com instead of WordPress.org, and they'll do a free one with ads with certain limitations. So they're selling that simplicity and that security and that stability. I mean, they'll do the updates for you, and they'll make sure it gets backed up. And that's what you're selling. You're selling those three things. Now, the issue I come into with Open Core is you're saying, well, it's like a loss leader. It's like shareware. It's like, I'll give you, like I remember one of the first shareware things I got was a dungeon, like a rogue clone. And you got the first 10 levels for free. And then if you wanted the other 50 levels, you'd send $5 to this guy in Virginia, and he sent back a floppy disk, and you got the other levels. And my question to all those people is, what if let's say you have the one feature that you're charging people for, what happens if one of your community members creates that feature and submits it as a pull request? Now, if you've gone and got investment and they're expecting you to have this hockey stick graph based upon this particular feature, can you accept the pull request? And an even more important question is, what if it works but it sucks?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you accept it and then hope it'll get fixed? Or, I mean, if you can't answer that question, you probably shouldn't be doing open core. But I honestly think that for most cases, the best way, unless it's like Ricardo said, unless you're targeting developers, like one of the big winners in open source acquisitions was JBoss. And I was very frustrated because OpenNMS was written in Java, JBoss was written in Java, but JBoss was aimed at Java developers. So their customers really knew the product, whereas OpenNMS was aimed at SREs. And SREs might know Python, they might know some JavaScript, but they're not going to know Java. And so it made it very, very difficult to build that value. And permissive licensing on things that are aimed at developers is a very, very good way to gain that adoption. Whereas other people may want to look at something like the Affero GPL and focus on a managed service.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely I mean, I'd say the first time you have to do a security update on WordPress is the day you realize that the value that managed services provide, right? And that's where your money goes. And actually, going back to my earlier experience with getting enterprises to move from proprietary to open source, there were always key criteria that would be blockers. And one of them was actually, okay, so the source code is free and I can build it, but that's no interest to me. I need, and this is terrible, but I need someone to point the finger to when things go wrong, right? And that's what basically these companies want. They want to pay someone so that when things go wrong, they can point. And sometimes that's actually a legal requirement of their, of the business or the environment they're in. So I think these were factors that I think helped open source grow up and provided obviously opportunities for companies to provide managed services, because it's not that you can't install and run the software. The question is, as a business and as a user, do you want to, right? And I really love those three things. I'm gonna remember that. I'm just thinking, Gab, there was
I'm going to try to too.
Stability and security.
Simplicity, security, and stability.
Yeah. I love it. I'm going to use that. There was a question actually that came up. Do you want to answer that question?
Yeah. Stephen Howe had a question on. It reminded me immediately of the XKCD cartoon where all of the infrastructure in the of the internet is
Nebraska,
dependent on one project of a thankless developer in Nebraska.
Yeah.
I'll read the question because some other people are watching it in a different platform. So Steven is asking, is it a potential danger to adoption? Oh, now they can see that on the screen. So yeah, that's great. Thanks, Shaked, for making that up for us. So you said that, sometimes the internet were all based on one software. Do you think it's a potential danger? We saw. I mean, I know a story from the NPM ecosystem where there was this guy that tried to get donations via this. There was like I can't remember now, an NPM package that put a code that write in the terminal, "Hey, hire me" or something like that, and that was a util that everyone got, like anyone that installed the one, and that made the question. Now it's just a funny story in the terminal, but tomorrow it could be. I don't know, some injection and stuff like that. I wanna try a different aspect of open source. I heard that in the last reinforced keynote. I can't remember the name. I think it's Bert, the CISO of AWS. I'm not sure the name, but there was another project that I was involved in, the AWS Cedar, language for policy. And the story is sure that Cedar itself did not have justification, like a business justification in AWS. It's not a product. Cedar is not a product. The incentive was AWS wanted to have a highly verified language for the AAM policies. And to make sure that this language is verifiable and had the right standard, AWS decided to open that. and not for the business reason of open sourcing stuff. Like I want to create a software and I'll do it open source. I want to create a software that I want to make sure for me, for my self usage, and I want to make sure it's stable and it's verifiable, and then I open that. Is that something common in AWS? I mean, I know about Cedar. There are any kind of other projects that go this way?
So Cedar's the one we talk about a lot. But I mean, the team that did that, if we look at that, the story of that, I think the bigger story here, okay, is that IAM, is one of our most foundational services, okay, because obviously all the requests that you make to the APIs need to be validated to make
billion
sure.
a second.
Yeah, exactly. It's a 1 billion requests per second.
Yeah.
And the challenge you've got as a business, okay, is that if you want to improve it, add new features, how do you do that safely? Right.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously the team looked to formal reasoning as a way of doing that. And there's actually a really good session from Reinforce that talks through the actual process of building the proofs using tools like Daphne and Lean. And effectively what they do, okay, is they actually if they took a long time to build proofs, they could use then the reasoning tools to validate IAM policies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, why would you do that? Well, the reason why they say they did it is because that in itself doesn't actually improve the performance of IAM, right? Because the code that outputs it, because you can transpile from Daphne to Java. But what it allows you to do is it allows you to create a testing and benchmark framework that allows you to then make changes to your IAM and then benchmark it against something you can prove, right? So you can now start to do more new features, okay, or bigger, more impressive features, okay, and still test them to make sure they're not breaking authentication or authorization, okay. And that's super powerful because now you've got a situation where you've got provability in how one code set versus another code set works. And I think the reinforced session is that they were able to improve performance by 65% in IAM, but more than that, they're allowed to release more features. So as a company, we are using formal reasoning in lots of kind of the core underlying infrastructure. So things like S3. When you look at Nitro enclaves, the security mechanism. So we use that to do, for example, provable boot. So we can when an EC2 instance boots up, we know it's not been tampered with. So we're using it a lot of things. A lot of the stuff that stuff isn't really open source though. So we see the outputs of it, but the tools are, and actually the teams are, they're contributing to things like Lean and Daphne and TLA Plus and P. So these are open source projects, right? Which those teams are very heavily involved in, and they speak at those conferences. They share some of the proofs because I mean, Lean. The reason why we moved from Daphne to Lean in Cedar was because there were more open source proofs available to make it so it was a community thing, right? So I think we are doing more things like that, Gab.
Yeah, I think the Daphne thing, for like people who are not familiar, Daphne is a very scientific language for like people who try to prove stuff in software. I think many people are not really familiar with that. I mean, actually, I wasn't familiar with that. I never been in this side of like the scientific creation of programming languages and stuff like that. And then I met Mike when you launched Cedar. We were the first partner of that. And I think one of the most exciting things about Cedar is that in the last in this keynote that I shared about in the last Reinforce, there was 6 companies that utilize Cedar. Each of them do something else with that. Each of them do a different business use case with that, and I think that could be a great like open source thinking. If your open source can serve as a core for multiple business cases, that means it's sustainable. Because if you need to pivot, you are not pivoting the open source to be something else. You are pivoting your business to be something else, and the open source can, stay the same.
Yeah.
What do you think about it?
We've seen that actually with Firecracker. So Firecracker is the micro VM open source software that powers serverless. Okay. Now, for most people, they think, okay, it's a really good way of optimizing the time to start of a container, right? But there was one company that realized they could use it for something completely different. And what they did is they had a CI/CD pipeline, okay, and the CI/CD pipeline had hundreds of steps. And so when they were actually running their CI/CD system, if you could optimize how one of those steps ran, you had a big impact on the overall time to complete each iteration. And so what they did is they actually reconfigured their the build steps, to use Firecracker, something it wasn't really designed to do, right? But they did it, and they actually blogged about this. And I think it might, I might be wrong here, but I think it was Stripe. It was one of the big engineering companies, and they were able to significantly cut down the time it took to do their software builds by using something that wasn't really designed to do it. But the developers were very creative, and they put it together. And that's one of my favorite stories, that one.
That's one of the things that I just adore about open source software, is your users will find unique ways to use your code that you didn't even think about. I mean, sometimes that causes problems, because then you get that corner case where something breaks. But I just love it. It's kind of like you create this thing and it takes on a life of its own, whereas proprietary software just seems to lock you in. Like I used to make an argument when I was talking to customers. I'm an old, and back in the day, everyone was migrating to these enterprise resource planning ERP systems like Bond and SAP. And what was funny is, you have a company that's successful. It's a very successful company, and they've done so because of the processes they've developed to cater to their customers. So they've created these unique processes. So then they say, oh, we need an ERP system. So now we've got to take our unique processes and change them to fit how these ERP systems want you to do things.
Yeah.
And I used to say, look, open source is the exact opposite. Open source, you can fit the tool to your processes, and you can still, that's the differentiator. I've seen so many people run out and buy software in a particular industry because that's what everybody else was doing. And I'd say, look, you're not competing on that. It's not who has the budget to buy this piece of software. What you're competing on is how well you take care of your customers. And in many cases, open source will let you do that. Because in our company, about 25% of our revenue came from custom development. Our product might do 90% of what a customer needs, and they would pay us to do the other 10%. And the sticking point was, I want to open source that. So you give us money, we'll do that 10%, but we want to make that part of the product. And they would almost always balk at that. Said, no, I don't want my competitor to get my tool. And I said, first of all, if by spending X amount of dollars doesn't get you a greater return, an X plus Y return, you shouldn't do it anyway. It doesn't make any business sense. But if you're gonna benefit from spending X dollars and you're going to get X plus Y dollars back, you should do it. And second of all, if you're competing on tools, you're going to lose. You're going to compete on your processes. And as anyone who's done a YAML file or JSON, or in my case, XML, you know that a lot of the functionality of any of these tools is based upon how you configure it. It's not based upon the tool itself. Like my wife, she works in finance, and she does amazing things with Excel. Like she manages this big budget with Excel. Now, if I bought a copy of Excel and called up Microsoft and said, "Where's my budget?" They'd laugh at you. They said, "What do you mean? No, we give you this software and you go and make your thing." And that's the thing I always love about it, is we try to democratize that tool. And then the value add, the actual intellectual property is not the software; it's in how you use it.
Love that. I mean, actually, when I look back to the early adoption of open source successes, that's how we actually were able to convince companies to move and switch, because I would do audits of proprietary software, and I would say, look, here's IBM WebSphere. Okay, you're using only 10% of the features. The other 80 or 90% of the features you are not using, right? So here's Apache Tomcat, right? So Apache Tomcat gives you everything that you need in that 10%. So when you have conversations like that, because I mean, these proprietary software, they have to justify their annual increase in support fees and new products, right? So they give you products that have got new features that often you don't need. So to your point, Tarus, you have to fit into how they think, and quite often you don't need to do that. So you basically end up people use things like Apache Tomcat and then bolt on other things as they need to. So that I've definitely seen that in early ways of how companies moved or transitioned from proprietary to open source.
Well, it's funny, when I was in university, it was when the Macintosh came out, and they were like 5,000 US at the time. I know no student could really afford them, but they'd have computer labs, and you would carry a floppy disk, an 800K floppy disk, and on that floppy disk I could put Mac OS, McWrite, McWord, and McPaint, or McWrite, McPaint, and McDraw. Those are the three.
For folks who don't know what they are, this is what they look like. This is what they look like.
Why did you 3D print the save icon? But I'd have still some room, and it's like it didn't have a spell checker, which I desperately need because I can't spell very well. But outside of that, it did everything. I could do drawings, I could drop them into documents, I could change the typefaces, I could, it was. And so once you create that, how do you get people to keep buying Microsoft Word? Or any of these proprietary products? You just add more and more features, and you can now, publish a book if you wanted to, but how many people do that? And that's one of the things that I really like about about open source, is that we do get, for the most part, until I started working at Amazon, I was fine with LibreOffice. We just do a little bit we're a document-oriented company, and we just do a little bit too much in Microsoft Word that I can't get away from Microsoft Word. But LibreOffice was fine. I mean, it did everything I needed to do. The function I use in a spreadsheet most is addition. This equals column A plus column B equals column C. That's about, and then just drag it down. Sum. That was it. Sum, and that was it. And but I do want to get back, since we did have one question from Stephen. I did want to get back. When you go and you're trying to tell your boss or a big company that they need to support open source because maybe they depend on something that only is either unfunded, it's a bunch of volunteers, or there's just one company that does it. I have found a lot of success in saying, hey, we need to buy support, etc., to frame it as a supply chain issue. To sit down and say, what would happen if this went away? And there's a lot more resonance in saying, look, you've got this stack that you've built on these open source tools. If one of them went away, what would you do? How much is that worth to you, and how can you support the people making that? But I think it is a danger if it's like that underappreciated developer in Nebraska. We end up with the Log4Shell. And I just loved everything because we used Log4j in our product. So of course we were scrambling to fix it. I was actually doing some consulting for a bank, and it hit on like a Friday. And so I'm calling the SVP I was working for and saying, dude, we need to get on this. And he's like, well, security's been calling me. I said, take the call. We need, you're a bank. You need to shut this down until we figure out how we're going to fix this. And just a reaction where people were sending demanding letters to the developers, and they're like, dude, no warranty. We didn't take any money to do this. There's no legal recourse. So write as many nasty letters as you want, And I still think we need to figure out, I believe managed open source is a great way for companies to make money. But what if you have a library? What if you have something that doesn't really fit in the managed open source model? What if it's not easy to build simplicity, security, or stability into a product? One way is we have these foundations. So we have a number of foundations out there, and what we need to do is convince major corporations, and we've done a very, very good job of convincing AWS to get involved in these foundations. One of my personal victories was we became a sponsor of the MariaDB Foundation. MariaDB, as you know, is Monty Videnius's take on MySQL when MySQL got acquired by Oracle. but what you may not know is there's a foundation, and then there's a business around it, and they're separate. And so if the business decides to withdraw support from the foundation, then the foundation can suffer. And I was very happy to watch to watch AWS see the value as a supply chain option, and decide to step up and fund this. And one of the things that will be released really soon is a vector search on MariaDB. It's in beta right now. It's insanely fast, and it's something we were able to create by going to this small organization that was pretty much solely responsible for all the development. And now, my friend Otto will yell at me for saying that. AWS also contributes code. Let me stress that. But the foundation is mainly responsible. The foundation and the corporation are mainly responsible for most of the code. And we need to support things like that. And so foundations are one way to do that.
I think foundation is a good point. But one thing that I also wanted to mention is getting back to the point of like the democracy. I think that a justification for having a business use case around your open source is when someone else is finding a new way to use that. And then at this point, you maybe can start have like borders so people will not cannibalize your use case. It maybe require, some roadmap decisions that say, okay, my open source now, I found that people can easily cannibalize me. I'm not going to change the license because that will make sure that my roadmap now is my business roadmap. I'm going to change what the open source do in a way that will avoid cannibalization. Again, it could be also change the roadmap, but at least you didn't take it back from the community. You still leave it to the community, and the community can decide. And then it not must be go to a fork. Can go to be in multiple directions that can help with that. I think I really want to go. I know that we promised to people to talk about the process of AWS with managing large scale of open source software. We discussed a lot of points from that, but I want to get a little more maybe practical or pragmatic. What are the various stages of an open source project in AWS? Assuming a project that starts in AWS and you want to take it from 0 to 100, what do you think is the stage?
I think key to understanding how to answer that question is understanding how Amazon is organized, right? So from the outside, you might think as Amazon is like a big corporation, okay, which it is at one level. But inside, we are a group of many thousands of small groups of people with ideas, hopes, aspirations, including open source, right? And so, and kind of the mentality really is that these teams self-organize, and they're optimized for autonomy, speed to market, and you can look at the Amazon leadership principles as a good way of looking at that. And so what this means is that there, no two teams will approach how they open source something or even think about open source the same way, right? So and so we have a very diverse approach, from those who haven't got a clue about open source and just have a go, to those who are really, really experienced. And this is why when we organized open source years and years ago, we kind of split into a number of different groups. We have the kind of OSPO side of it, which basically is the kind of engineering side, making sure our policies and strategy and all that kind of stuff set up. And then we've got the team Taurus is in, which helps our service teams make sure they're good open source citizens and understand what they're doing. But we absolutely think of, and what we try and encourage our teams to think about, is that open source is a one-way door, and we have this thinking in Amazon of one-way and two-way doors. Two-way doors are things you can do, and you might lose some time, some money, but you can come back from. One-way doors are big decisions where you invest for the long term. And so what we tell people inside is that if you're going to get involved in open source, you've got to think about this as a one-way door. So think about it from a resource, a budgeting, and that kind of thing, so that when you just do something, it's not a case of just throwing some code over the open source wall, right, and then leaving it. It's actually, there's an investment in there that you've got to think about and plan for.
When I joined AWS, one of the first documents I wrote, I was trying to get my brain around it because, AWS, one of the things I kind of struggle with is getting used to a company that is so customer focused and also really cares about being good, like doing things legally. And I was talking to service managers, and they would take a piece of open source code, and they'd look at the license and say it's Apache 2.0 license, and they say, "Oh, I can use this. I run it through legal. I'm following the rules." Because they didn't come from 20 years of open source and they didn't understand the community aspect. So one of the first documents I wrote is I told a story. I live in a very small town in the center of North Carolina in the United States. And our very first ethnic restaurant was a Chinese restaurant called the Bamboo Garden. Now, I'm not counting pizza places as ethnic because I'm just not. We had a pizza place. We had Sir Pizza as a pizza place, but we had, and this is the first we had Chinese food restaurant. And every Sunday they have a buffet. And you get up, you go to church, you go to the buffet. This whole town would almost turn out for this buffet, and they had a steam table. And one of the things they put on the steam table was crab legs, snow crab legs, which is a high dollar, very unusual thing to get in Ashburn, North Carolina. Well, there was this one guy who would take them all. Like they'd bring the tray out, and he would go with his plate, and he would take this 2 pounds of snow crab legs, the whole thing. Go back to the table, eat them, and sometimes he'd come back again. Oh, wow. And it pissed everybody off. Like people would when they saw him coming, they'd block him. It was this weird social thing because technically by the rules of all you can eat, he was fine. He was perfectly legit in his taking all the crab legs. But there's a social contract. There's a social contract where you don't do that.
Yeah.
And one of the things our department does is try to add that in. I mean, these service managers they're brilliant people. They're not stupid, but you have to add, it's an educational thing where you go and say, look, here's this unwritten social aspect to open source software where you need to get involved. We talk about Valkey. We had convinced the people involved in our database engines that we needed to be involved in these open source projects. And we have a person named Madeline Olson, and they were a maintainer of Redis, and they were on staff, and they knew all the other maintainers. And when Redis did the license change, it was Madeline and the other maintainers who worked for different companies who came to us and said, we want to continue this project as open source, and we can't under these new this new format that Redis has adopted. We want to continue doing what we're doing. Can you support us in that? And that's what AWS ended up doing. And it's an education thing that there's this social aspect that I think we need to tell businesses about. And like I mentioned earlier, framing it as a supply chain issue is one way to get people involved and understand that if you're going to use open source, if you're going to consume open source, especially on a scale, you need to get involved and give back in some fashion.
I think the social contract is a very interesting point to talk about because society has different rules, and rules depends in culture. And do you think that we have this open source land where all the society agree? Or do you think we need to bridge different cultures into that? Because at the end, open source is people, right? It's more than just software.
We are seeing, I mean, I see that on a regular basis from people like Tarus and myself who were there at the beginning and have got a long history and seeing how open source has evolved, to newer developers who literally don't understand the history and have that, not lack of understanding of what the social contract is. So, that's why it's really important to make sure that we, educate, the new generation of developers into kind of what open source is and why it's important, and things like why license matters, and why and the stuff that kind of the open source initiative doing and defending the open source licenses, why that's important. And so I think we do definitely, the people who are more experienced have a responsibility in making sure that we can educate the kind of the less experienced to try and kind of bridge that gap. But I don't see it as something that is in one region or the other. I see this as a thing that globally, when I speak to developers, and I mean, I think the classic case, is recently with Llama. okay, Meta's Llama, where they misannounced it as open source, right? And now wherever I go, everyone talks about Llama as being open source, and then you correct them, and they say, well, no, because they said it was open source, so therefore it must be, right? And so then you have to go into the details, and so then it becomes clear as well. There's a fundamental lack of knowledge in actually what open source is in large groups of developers. Now the question is, what can we do about that? Because the response I tend to get is that, well, we don't really care that much. And the reason why they don't care is because they want to use the software. But when you frame it as, well, okay, you want to build a solution. Okay, you might want to sell this solution. If you don't have a license that's compatible with OSI, you may not be able to sell that solution in the way that you think. A lot of startups use open source software, right? Have you considered acquisition? If you're acquired, suddenly your IP might be null and void. And actually, when I was in my previous organization, I was involved in a number of acquisitions of small companies with larger companies that actually failed because they had failed to understand the open source licenses on which they were using. So effectively rendered the IP of that company completely useless. And there were many tiers and sometimes threats, that I had around, you got to keep this quiet, or what can we do? You've got to be able to do something, right? Because this is my livelihood, right? So, and that all comes down to this lack of education and understanding, and we all need to help there.
Yeah.
I have way much more to talk about this, but I think we're running close on time, and there's a couple of questions that I'd like to get to.
Absolutely. Actually, Stephen's first question was in my agenda, so I'm happy he asked that, because that's it.
We can't talk about that if you actually planned on talking.
So he asking that many university students are interested in contributing to open source software for various reasons, but they fear they don't have the coding skill. Is there a way students can contribute to open source projects, and might AWS hiring manager finds open source contribution a plus?
So this is a great question, and I actually did a talk on this to my old high school. There was this when I was young, there was this big catch-22. You couldn't get a job without experience, and you couldn't get experience without a job. Now the beauty is we have this thing called GitHub, and there's GitLab, and there's other options. But I'm gonna talk about GitHub. And if you've ever been at GitHub, you've got your little squares, and they're dark green, and they're it shows your activity. I tell people, find something that you're interested in that has an open source project. It could be, I don't know, guitar tabulature. I'm certain there's a guitar tab project out there somewhere. And get involved. Get on the Discord or Slack or IRC if it's still around for that particular company. Get involved in that project, and you don't have to be a coder. And like Rich Bowen, who's now a director of the Apache Foundation, Software Foundation, he started out writing documentation. And you may need to struggle to find a group that accepts people, because my experience was, I would get these people who would email me or something that says, oh, this is good, but what you need to do is, and they'd send me a laundry list of stuff. And I was like, look, dude, I'm painfully aware of where my product falls short and what needs to get done. Send me the pull request. And then I'd have this other person who goes, look, I'm not a very good coder, but this is my first pull request, but I wrote this little thing, and it would be brilliant. Like, it's commented, it follows all of the standard stuff that we ask for people, and it was brilliant. And it's incumbent upon the community manager or whoever's running this to really nurture those people, to give them a lot of praise and to say, thank you. No, this is great. We really appreciate you doing this. And if I was a younger person going to a job, I would say, here's my GitHub account. Look at what I've done. And it shows that you play well with others, that you can manage, because every community is going to have conflict, that you can manage conflict, and that you can build your skills, because a lot of people will help you with that.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. In fact, actually, one of the best CVs that I saw a few years ago was a juniorish. He had one job before, but he was still very young in his career, and he actually articulated in his CV that he worked for a number of projects, and the way he did it was brilliant. Is that he talked about the projects that he was involved in, and the way he framed it was, I'm responsible for doing releases for this project. I've made code changes in this which have impacted 1.3 billion users of this software. And the way he did it in a very data-driven way made you realize that this person not only had the technical skills, but as Tora said, had the soft skills to execute. And I think that on a CV is worth so much, right? You know, Stephen, how he works with students, we do actually kind of like try and work with university students and tell them about open source and try and give them some of these tips, right, on how to get started in this way, right? To try and give them pathways to not just code contributions, because I think I read, I think it was one of Matt's posts, I think something like 40%, I think, of contributions are code. The rest are non-code contributions. So things like, you know, triaging, managing releases, even writing documentation or blog posts or evangelizing projects. So there's lots of different ways you can get involved in open source, not just code, right? So there's lots of opportunities.
I have a question from another aspect on this one. So we are all technical people, but there are many like non-technical open source things to do. Sometimes even like the most boring one, like I'll say legal. I'll take the. What is your like advice to keep yourself focused when you have this disruption of whole day just taking care for ping pong with
So
legal?
I've got an answer for this, right? So back in the early days, right, when I was doing this for enterprise, for customers of my previous employer, one of the things that I always encouraged was building a relationship with stakeholders who might not be technical. So a good example, you mentioned legal, but there's others like, for example, HR and procurement. Yeah. So what I would say is that, you know, I would give presentations within these companies to procurement. And I was like, I'm going to talk to you about something called open source. And they were going, why do you need to know about this? And I would say, you know, you currently handle all software procurement, right? I had a look at your contract. You currently do not talk about open source in your contracts with suppliers. And then we do that. I do the presentation. And then suddenly out of a group of maybe 50, 60, 70 people, there's normally a group of like 2 or 3 that get interested and realize that, okay, well, there's an angle here from the point of view of we need to understand open source with a lens of procurement so that we can have better contracts, we can reduce our risk, and we can start putting that into the contract. And one of the outcomes that I got from it was they were able to shift the emphasis on support based on the contract they had. I did the same thing with HR from the point of view of HR wanted to know, why do we need to know about open source? And I said, look, you are trying to find the best technical talent in the planet. You are doing it through LinkedIn and through recruitment agencies, but you can expand this by working with your technical teams and reach into technical communities where you've got opportunities and find and actually sort of like, you know, kind of like try and find the right people for your organization. And I had some success there. So there are opportunities. It's about you going to those different teams and finding out what the alignment is for open source for that particular area.
Yeah, I think that's a great advice. In general, like building relationship can help you in a tech organization. Mike also saying that guilting enterprise isn't a sustainable strategy for land and expand that startup need to build predictable ARR. It also hasn't been sustainable for most of the community project. Companies only buy stuff because it need to build sales or cut costs. Any thoughts?
Well, I've spent a lot of time. I mean, I spent 20 years trying to find a way to build a business around open source. And it comes back to those 3 things: the simplicity, security, and stability. Yeah. And guilting enterprises, I agree 100% with Mike that you can't guilt. You know, no one's going to write a check because they feel guilty. Yeah. Which is one of the things that I found a lot of success in reframing open source as a supply chain issue. One of the we were talking about open source at AWS. One of the projects that I'm very proud of is a project called MapLibra, and it grew out of a company called Mapbox decided to change its license. And this is a tile server, basically. If you want to make pretty maps on your web, on your phone or your device or a browser, this is a library that was being used, and a community ended up creating a fork, and AWS supported it along with Meta and Microsoft. So it's kind of cool. There were a number of other companies that I was talking, but those were the 3 largest ones, because they all had a supply chain. They all needed this technology. And one of the things that I think we need to do as a community is more proactively go out and say, look, we need to find a way to support this. But again, it can be a problem. I just worked on a project where a community group wanted to integrate with Bedrock with our Gen AI tool, and it was just a bunch of people, and it's like I can't give money to a bunch of people.
Yeah.
And so we ended up finding an organization that would act as an umbrella that I could actually, they could send us a PO, and we could send a PO to them. They could give us an invoice, and we could get them paid. And I still think that's a big challenge. Even if you can provide those things, but definitely guilt doesn't work. We need to point people using data, saying this is core to your business. This is core to how you do best by your customers. And if you don't pay attention to this, you can get stuck, and then then it may be too late. So
yeah. So with that, we are getting to the end of this hour. And Tarus, you're absolutely right. We can do it for more 7 hours without taking a break, and we probably should. We have a full time.
We'll have to have a part 2, Gabe.
Yeah.
uh,
So thank you very much. If you have any kind of last words you want to say, now's the time.
it's been a lot of fun. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
thank you very much. And if you're listening, make sure you check out Valky. That's what I'm going to tell people to do.
Yeah. And that was my chance to meet Ricardo 2 months ago. Valky made us meet in the
Yeah.
Nice. There you go.
That was a fortuitous moment.
Thank you very much, and talk soon.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.